here. Arabia is going to become very important to us in a couple of chapters. All right. Anybody have any questions or comments? We have 2 classes and then the test. All right. We left off last time talking about the family, and I don't know why, but your authors only hint at what I'm about to say. They used to go into a whole lot more detail. What they do say about the family was that originally the father was the head, and the father even had the right to execute his own children if he so wished. And then as time went on, the father's authority got less and less, to where fathers no longer had the right to execute their children. And women got more and more freedom as time went on. All right. The authors stopped there. And elsewhere in the chapter, they hint other things were going on in a family. Essentially, though, family life crumbled and broke apart as the empire wore on. In the early days of the Republic, when Rome was first starting, divorce was uncommon. Most men married, stayed married, the rest of all, they married one time, men and women married one time and stayed married until the day they died. And they had children, and the children also would marry and stay married until the day they died. Then came the Punic Wars, and the wars that followed, the wars for control of the empire, the wars between Caesar, Augustus, and Mark Antony, or between Julius Caesar and Pompey. And these wars had a really bad effect on family life. At least that's what standard history says. Now, anyway, it got to where divorce became very, very common, and you had a big increase in the number of unmarried adults. I'm talking about not adults who married later in life, but adults who never married at all. An increase in the number of bachelors, and increase in the number of old maids. What about this? Folk, I'm going to wind up repeating this probably today anyway, but it almost appears like mankind's worst enemy is not war, is not plague. No, mankind's worst enemy is prosperity, wealth. Who got divorced the most in Roman society? The richer people, the wealthier. Who's the most likely to get divorced now? I'm fast forwarding now to 21st century America. Who's most likely to get divorced? In a lot of cases, folk, it's the wealthy. The number one reason couples divorce has been said, now again, it depends on who you read and when you read it, has been said the number one reason is arguments over money. It's not necessarily a lack thereof, it's a lot of one person in the marriage wants to spend more than the other one does, and they get into arguments over it that oftentimes are unresolvable. It is known that Roman people began to value 3 things very highly in choosing a marriage partner. Those 3 things were looks, personality, and money. And if you think we're doing the same thing, now I have a little secret to tell you that some of you may have heard already. Not any one of those 3 have anything at all to do with making for a successful, happy marriage. If any of you want to contest that, you're welcome to. I had one student one time who did. If you want more information, you could ask Ted Turner, or if she were still alive, you could ask Elizabeth Taylor. There's some of the wealthier, richer, better-looking people in the country. Ted Turner, the last time his wife left him, remember the last wife of Jane Fonda by name, he said, "I wish somebody could tell me how to make a marriage work." I wish somebody could tell him. But anyway, whatever the case is, divorce became very commonplace. This instability ultimately led to a big decline in population. Now, that ultimately led to the barbarian people coming in from Germany and from all the way in, but over from that, for that matter, all the way from Mongolia, and destroying the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, folk, I think I've already said this, but I will repeat it. The Roman Empire fell from within more than without. When your family life is unstable, all of society becomes unstable with it. Divorce is crippling and crushing to the persons who go through it. And it does permanent damage, oftentimes, to children who go through it. It was not, like I say, it became very commonplace in the later Roman Empire, and ultimately is believed by some to have led to the Roman Empire's decline. Caesar Augustus saw the trend and tried to stem it by outlawing adultery, one of the things that causes divorce. Outlawing pornography, another thing that is known to lead to divorce. His laws were enforced, but it did not stem the tide. Also, and again, the authors in earlier versions of this book mentioned this, but homosexuality became more rampant as time went on. It was almost unheard of in the earlier days of the empire. It got worse as time went on. The Romans blamed their Greek slaves for corrupting their morals. They say, we brought these Greeks in and they were that way and they got us to be that way. Be that whatever it may, as time went on, it became an issue with some Romans also. All right, anybody have any comments on the family? To me, it was a big issue in the reasons why the Roman Empire ceased to exist. Slaves. Roman society was what we would call a slave society, and that they had a lot of slaves at first, but then as time went on, slavery became less and less. Now, who were the slaves? The slaves were oftentimes persons who had been taken in war, taken captive, and the victorious generals would sell their captured prisoners as slaves, or sometimes there were criminals who had committed not so bad a crime, but a moderate bad crime, and who were sold to slavery for a period of time. Well, after a couple of hundred years, during a period of a couple hundred years of Pax Romana, the war stopped. When the war stopped, there came a decrease in slaves, and slaves were oftentimes only slaves for a period of maybe 10, 15, 20 years. In short, what happened was slaves became fewer and fewer in number. And typically a Roman couple would get married, let's say a rather wealthy couple, buy a slave, a few years later get a little bit richer and buy another slave. But then after about 10 years, both of these slaves had to be freed because they're only slaves for a certain tenure of time. By this time, there were so few slaves available, the price of slaves had gone out of sight for the ordinary Roman citizen. So then the Roman housewife, or Roman wife, would find she would have to do the work that the slaves had formerly done. And this was just demeaning, and she would oftentimes blame her husband, hey, it's because you're not rich enough. And the husband would say, hey, you know, I could afford slaves at one time, but the price of slaves had gone up. Now, I want to say this about slavery, because any of you who have studied American history knows that at one time was a problem. There never was a slave institution as racist as the one we had here in the United States up until 1865. In other words, in the case of the Romans, true, some of the slaves were Greek, some were African, but some of them were Romans themselves who had fallen into poverty and had to, or their fathers had sold them as slaves to pay off a debt. In other words, it wasn't like only one race or only one nationality were slaves. Their slaves were a mixed race. The sometimes would rise up in rebellion. About every generation they'd have a rebellion. The most famous rebellion was the one involving Spartacus. He and thousands of his followers were crucified. And I think I mentioned the big problem that Spartacus had was he could not keep his people organized. Whereas in the Damascus, they had an automatic system of organization where the emperor was in charge and whoever he appointed as officers, they were in charge. In the case of Spartacus, his authority was questioned to begin with. Hey, what right do you have to be an authority over us? And the result was the rebellion fizzled, faded, and his followers were killed. Bread and circuses. I'm now talking about, I'm looking at page 139, Imperial Rome. Bread and circuses. The time came when Rome had a whole lot of idle poor people to feed. And yes, they fed their idle and their poor. The result was typically a man had little or no incentive to do better. Hey, if I don't work, I'm going to be fed anyway. Besides that, I tried finding a job once and couldn't. So they would live off the state. It was like history's first recorded public welfare program. What was to try to keep them happy was not just bread, not just food. You know, they're given food, but they're also given entertainment. The entertainment consisted of circuses and gladiatorial shows. The gladiators would oftentimes fight to the death. The gladiatorial games ran from dawn to dusk, and a lot of these idle poor people had nothing else better to do, would go to a gladiatorial show and watch the spectacles. And they would go there just to see someone killed. Just a bloodthirst, a love of brutality in sports. Now, folk, even when I was a kid, I had teachers who compared the United States to Rome. And most recently, I've heard that the United States really is a continuation of Rome. Where Rome left off, the United States took up. And we have domed capitals, and we have a Senate, and we have the veto power of a president. Very similar to what Rome had. And we have a love of sports, and perhaps even a love of brutality in sports. Be that what it may. Now, eventually, the gladiatorial games were stopped. But in addition to the gladiatorial games, there were certain types of games where they would starve a lion for several days, then turn it loose on a criminal, and the crowds would gather in the Colosseum to watch the lion tear a criminal to pieces. Well, there came an instance where that Christians, instead of criminals, they put Christians in the lion's den, and then turned the lion out of his cage, and the Christians were torn to pieces. Eventually, though,